Hello, my name is Karen, and I am an occupational therapy student at Kaiser University's MS-OT Bridge program. As part of my online fieldwork experience, I am creating weekly YouTube videos discussing various topics. This week's coursework included running a virtual group through Zoom with another student. The group's theme was stress management and dealing with anxiety from COVID-19. For this week's YouTube video, I will be answering various questions about the group and discussing what the group contained. For my group, I ran with Chelsea, another student in my class, and we chose two activities that tied into the overarching theme of stress management. Our first activity was identifying stressors that have occurred because of COVID, and then facilitating conversation from the group members to discuss ways to combat this stress. This was a really good idea because it got conversation flowing and also allowed group members to hear ideas from other participants of things they might not have thought of how to relieve stress. Our second activity was progressive muscle relaxation. This was to help combat the muscle tension that can be experienced as a physical side effect from increased anxiety or increased stress. The first question that we will be discussing this week is, how do I feel the group activity went? I think our group went really well as both activities tied into the overarching theme of stress management. I also think running the group went well because Chelsea and I had good communication beforehand and went into the group with a good plan of what was going to happen. The second question is, what are some strategies you implemented to help the group run smoothly? As I mentioned before, Chelsea and I had strong communication before we even began the group session. We made sure to plan several days in advance on what activities we'd be doing and who would be running each activity. We practiced our transitions between the intro, the icebreaker, activity 1, 2, and the wrap up. I think this was really beneficial as it can be kind of off-putting when you're not in the same room with the person to run a group, so practicing before allowed us to know who was going to speak when. Another tip that I find useful for running virtual groups is making sure to use the person's name to help point conversation in that direction. So whereas when you're in a room and you can make direct eye contact with someone to cue them to start talking next, when you're virtual you don't have that luxury. So we made sure to say, okay, here I will say, Karen, how do you feel this one? Or insert group member name here, how do you feel this one? Using names is definitely a good trick for virtual groups. The third question is, compare what you saw in the YouTube video to how your group was run. What are some similarities and what are some differences? This week we watched a YouTube video on dancing and dementia. It was all about a group run that helped individuals with dementia participate in social activities as well as being active by performing some dance moves while seated in a chair. Although our groups had different overarching themes, the similarities were the importance of that social participation. In the dance group, it was having members dance together and be able to laugh and share experiences, whereas in Chelsea and my group, the group participation was collaborating together to come up with stress management techniques. And that led to socialization and people being able to relate to experiences they've had together since this pandemic started. Also, both groups were facilitated by a group member, or in our case, two group members. This helps keep things on track. The next question is, what did you find challenging about running this group? Internet connection. During our group, I lost internet connection, so Chelsea was left alone with the group members. Although this isn't the end of the world, it definitely made things a little bit tricky. But again, I think having clear communication and a plan before you go in is very helpful because Chelsea knew what was coming next and was able to keep the group going so they didn't have to wait for me to join back in. The last question is, what changes would you make if you were given the opportunity to run this group again? Honestly, there weren't any changes I could come up with. I think this group went off really well. The collaboration between participants during the identifying stress activity went way better than I thought it would, and actually multiple participants were able to come up with ideas to combat stress that I hadn't thought of before. So it was really interesting to hear, to be able to pass that on to future participants and also to implement in my own life during this stressful time. Perhaps trying to find a room with better internet connection would be better, but that's kind of unpredictable. And I really think that just because we had such good communication beforehand, things went off really well. The only change I would make would be being able to run this group in person, which unfortunately isn't possible right now. but running it in person would allow us to have a little more control of the environment. For the first activity, participants needed a paper and pen. We did mention this during our group introduction, but this can be a bit challenging. People might have to leave the room to go gather these supplies if they didn't know in advance. Also, the second activity, the progressive muscle relaxation, is ideally taking place in a quiet room, preferably with the lights dimmed and comfortable chairs. And this isn't always possible as people might be participating from their cars if they're, on a mobile Wi-Fi spot. I was in an office, so you can't really control the environment with a virtual group, so that might be something to change. But again, right now that's not possible. Overall, I think this week's group activity was really a good learning experience. It taught me that although we might need to adapt right now with the environment we're in, it's really not that difficult if you just prepare and plan ahead, and you're still able to run very successful groups even if it's being held virtually. Thank you so much for joining me this week.